The Asian American community is one of the most diverse in the country. In 2023, there were nearly 25 million Asian Americans in the United States, making up about 7% of the population. And that number is up, with Asians being the fastest growing racial and ethnic demographic in the country. But within that, the histories, the lives, the cultures, they stretch across generations and across borders. This is What We Brought, a limited series from Illinois Public Media about the Asian American experience in Central Illinois, told through stories of resilience, adaptation, and identity. I'm your host, Nidhi Shastri. In this series, we're diving into the stories about what we carry with us, whether it's memories, food, language, or even the echoes of trauma. You'll hear from Asian American voices of at least 7 different cultures and diasporas, each now calling Central Illinois their home. They'll share their stories, the journeys they took, the things they left behind, and, of course, what they brought with them. Today's episode features a writer and journalist whose words are shaping the way we understand Asian American history, both in his retelling of key historical events and in the sharing of his own personal story.
To understand yourself or to understand any of ourselves, we're here because of choices that our parents made, right? Or that our grandparents made or our forebears. But the way we think, the way we see the world, the way we laugh, the way we listen, these are also things we learn from our parents. And so I wanted to capture all of those different ways in which, we are the inheritors of these traditions and ways of being.
Few people know Asian American history as deeply as Hua Hsu, who spent a lot of time thinking about it. Hua's influence has rippled across American literature with a uniquely Asian beat. You can find his writing in books of historical records like Corky Lee's Asian America, his stories about music and society published in various issues of The New Yorker, and even his zines, a hobby he's had since at least his college days, found tucked away in bookstores for readers to find. And with the release of his memoir, Stay True, he's now a Pulitzer Prize winner, a well-deserved title and a further solidification of him as a beacon in Asian American literature and history. When you ask someone where they're from, you'll usually get a place, a city, a state, maybe a country, but for Hua Hsu, that answer comes with a bit of a myth.
It's funny, Urbana-Champaign has always had this mythic hold on my imagination because I was born there, but I grew up in California. I have no memories at all of Illinois, but I think being a kid in Silicon Valley in the 80s and 90s, it seemed so exotic to me that I was from Urbana-Champaign. And I would basically tell people I was born in Chicago, not knowing that Chicago and Urbana-Champaign they're not very close at all. But nobody in the Silicon Valley, in Cupertino, really knew the difference. I was born there because my parents were both graduate students at the University of Illinois, another mythic institution for me. I remember when I was a teenager, the Fighting Illini went really far in March Madness one year, and I had this enormous amount of pride. I hope to one day actually see the campus. But they met because they were in graduate school. My father came to the United States from Taiwan in the late 60s. First, he was in Amherst in Massachusetts. Then he was at Columbia in New York. And then he followed his advisor to Illinois, which I guess is what you did back then. You would just sort of follow your PhD advisor. My mother came in the early 70s. She first started off at Michigan State in Lansing, and then she transferred to Illinois, and that's where they met. And I'm often just in awe of the fact that they were able to navigate so much of America, with very little understanding of the culture. I mean, they spoke English, but not as well as people may have wanted them to at the time. But to go from Massachusetts to New York to Illinois, or to go from Michigan to Illinois, it just still pretty wild to me that they were able to just uproot from Taiwan to the US, but then to navigate the US as well in the early 70s.
So, in your writing, I'm going to pivot a little bit. You've revisited many social political points in Asian American history, such as our loss of Corky Lee and the many afterlives of Vincent Chin. Why do you write about Asian American history, and what has the impact of writing about that been on you?
So I think I'm sufficiently old enough where when I was in college in the 1990s, that was the first time I would have ever learned about a lot of these things. Asian American history, the stories of how the identity came to be, or waves of immigration, or activism in the 1960s, political gains in the 70s and 80s. These just weren't things that I had access to. Maybe if I'd really dug deep in the library, I could have learned more about these things, but these were things that really opened my eyes when I was a college student. And so in college in the 1990s, I imagined a future in which maybe I'd be able to tell these stories to future generations. Of course, it's different now. I think when I'm teaching at college, like a lot of students arrive with a lot more knowledge than I had. Everyone just has access to more information. But I think I'm still drawn to telling some of these stories and keeping these stories alive and meaningful. And I think everyone's just always in search of a context. And for me, these were meaningful contexts to learn about. And even though people have access to these stories, like I hope I'm offering them in a different way, or offering people a different sense of who they are, who they have been, and who they can be.
Yeah. For what it's worth, I mean, I started college in 2015 and I didn't know anything at that point. And I'm still learning today, but your work has helped me learn. And I think that's like a unique angle too, because there's stories that I've obviously read or done my own research on, but like the angle and the narrative you bring to it, I think is unique. So thank you.
Vincent Chin's story you brought up, the reason I wrote that is because a few years ago there were all of these like podcasts and movies and TV shows that were trying to tell the story of Vincent Chin, who was this Chinese American guy who was killed the night of his bachelor party by these two kind of disgruntled working class white guys in Detroit. Become this very
I'll jump in
mythic
here. In
moment in Asian American
2022,
history.
Hua wrote an article published in The New Yorker called The Many Afterlives of Vincent Chin. It stems from, as Hua mentioned, the murder of a young Chinese American man in Detroit, Michigan, during a time when anti-Asian and anti-Japanese sentiments were rampant. Automaking jobs were being outsourced, factories were closing, and imported cars were becoming more popular. Despite the fact that, at this time, German cars were just as affordable and popular, American politicians, radio and TV broadcasters, and even union leaders from the United Auto Workers Group all contributed to scapegoating the small Japanese American community, with some even encouraging the use of slurs against anyone or anything that might appear of Japanese origin. On June 19, 1982, two white auto workers who had been laid off from their job began hurling racial slurs at Vincent Chin at a bar. When Chin confronted them, they doubled down, eventually chasing Chin outside and beating him with a baseball bat. He died a few days later. The two men got probation and a small fine, no jail time. In Hua's own words, the killing of Vincent Chin remains a definitive turning point for Asian Americans. Chin was a versatile, iconic presence in virtually any discussion of Asian American history, meaningful across political and geographical divides.
It had become this very mythic moment in Asian American history, and we're on this precipice of that moment being turned into these podcasts and movies and TV shows that, may have lost some of the nuance of what was actually happening and the movement that grew up behind it. So I think even though we have a lot of access, and even though these stories are, I think, more popular, it's more conceivable that these things will be part of our popular culture, it's still important to have that, I don't want to say scholarly, but like a kind of rigorous perspective on what these moments felt like in the past too.
Hua is currently an author, a professor and a staff writer at The New Yorker. His memoir, Stay True, is a tender, searching portrait of friendship, loss, and identity. But it's also a story about the invisible threads, family histories, cultural inheritances, quiet sacrifices that help shape who we become.
It's like an interesting trope within Asian American literature, which is what I often teach, that younger generations view their parents' stories or their lineage, and they want to tell those stories, but oftentimes the older generation doesn't want to tell those stories. And sometimes it's because there's trauma, right? Or there's just a culture of silence, or for whatever reason. And I think I have been drawn to exploring the histories of my family, or of, I guess, ordinary people, in part because I think one of the things is, like, my parents don't view their stories as part of history. Like, they view themselves as living, I guess, like, alongside American history, but not as part of American history. And for better or for worse, it is. I think immigrants are obviously fundamental to America. They always have been. They will continue to be, one hopes. And I think there was part of me was just interested in kind of putting these stories back into, like, history. And so I've written about my parents, written about my grandparents, things like that. I think for myself, and the more personal story at the heart of Stay True, it wasn't really about writing from the perspective of an Asian American or contributing to, I guess, like, Asian American stories. It was just a thing I needed to write because it's based on a really good friendship that I had in college, and a loss, a personal loss. Our good friend was killed when we were in college, and I, it sort of set me down this path to become a writer and to want to think about the relationship between the present and the past through writing. And so writing Stay True was more of a purely personal endeavor. But in doing it, I didn't really think about how it would connect with Asian Americans, or sort of non-Asian American readers, um, because it's certainly also about what it was like to grow up as this Asian American person in the 1990s. So it's been really gratifying to see it read in that context, even though that wasn't the inspiration behind it. The inspiration behind it was just to, I don't know, interrogate questions of, like, grief and friendship and youth.
How long did it take you to write Stay True? Like, what year did you start writing it? I'm just curious.
It's a complicated question because the book looks back on this friendship that started in 1995, and the pivotal incident in the book, like the death happens in 1998, and it was so kind of upsetting that the first thing I did when my friend Ken died was to start writing. And so, in some ways, I started writing parts of the book in 1998 when I was 21, and it was just because I didn't, you know, late 90s, like, therapy wasn't really as popular as it is now. Um, we were just kids. Like, there's no real sense of what to do. So for me, my reaction was just to write. And I kind of never stopped writing. And in some ways, even though my journalism has never been about the events in Stay True, like, it's often in the backgrounds. And so in some ways, it took me 24 years to write because I was thinking about it for this whole time. But in practical terms, I mean, it took me maybe a year once I sat down to write it, because I'd been waiting to do something like this for quite a while, and I yeah, I was just sort of waiting to feel ready to do it, and then once I felt ready, it all just kind of came out, which is very different from how I usually write. It's usually kind of torturous and meticulous, but there are a lot of parts of the book that I look at now and I don't remember writing, because I think there was something inside me that was waiting to be released, that I finally had the opportunity to sort of, like, sit there and do.
At a time when Asian communities are facing threats to our safety, our ability to live in the US, what does being Asian mean to you? Do you have any other advice or thoughts for our community on what's happening socially and politically, and if it connects us to resilience of our ancestors in the past?
This is a big question. I think about it a lot because I've always felt less alone whenever I've surveyed history. If you look at the past, you think about what people, whether it's like one's own parents or people adjacent to my parents or just people in the 18, like there's been this long tradition of people who haven't felt like they belonged, and yet they find ways to belong, or they find ways to find community. And I find that really powerful. It's just sort of this reminder that you don't need to do everything by yourself. Like, people have been down these paths before. I think the interesting thing is that in the 1990s, for example, when I first started learning about these things, I was drawing on a lot of traditions that were, by their nature, more interested in questions of like equality and justice. Maybe they were a little bit more like progressive forms of community. And I think nowadays we're seeing a lot of communities that are, same people, same marginalized folks, but folks may be drawn to more conservative outlooks that are not necessarily how I feel. And on one hand, I want to say, no, like historically, we don't have to go down this path. There are other ways in which we can be more inclusive. And then on the other hand, I have to respect that that's just what community looks like for other people. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure.
And I think that that's hard for me to do, right? Because I look at things like, the killing of Vincent Chin in the early 1980s, and the incredible like multiracial progressive movements that grew out of that. It really changed. I mean, my parents remember that. They weren't even that politically involved, but they were like, that was a moment where we recognized that that could have been us too, right? And that we needed to see ourselves as part of a community. And yet, I think someone could look at that today and have like a completely different political reaction to that moment. And I think we saw that a couple years ago when there was a lot more kind of like nationalist or reactionary response to anti-Asian violence. And so I just think that it's a conversation that needs to be had, just kind of what vision of community we want to be a part of, and history is really useful, but not everyone is going to use history as their guide. And we just need to talk to each other and figure out what community means to us and what it can be. Because I think sometimes it's hard to imagine what you want unless you talk to other people, or unless you consult the past, or maybe if you have your ideas about the past shaken a bit. So I think that we see a lot of desire for community and connection in America right now. Unfortunately, it just comes out in like somewhat ugly ways.
At a time when many Asian Americans have had to question our safety, belonging, and future in the United States, Hua's work reminds us we've been here before, and we've survived. Community, after all, isn't always a given for us. It's something we've had to work hard to cultivate. Often, it's through a simple conversation. Sometimes it's through an Asian friend group, providing couches to crash on during international travel, or through thoughtful invitations for a home-cooked meal that celebrates our shared cultures. And sometimes, it's even through activism and advocacy. When things get tough for any one pocket of the Asian American community, the solidarity that emerges. This is what becomes our memories and legacies for what we've brought and what we've made. I've asked Hua to read a bit of his book for us so we can hear in his voice his piece of Asian American history.
It's from the early part of the book where I talk about my parents' immigration to the United States. And so this is about them. The first generation thinks about survival. The ones that follow tell the stories. I often try to spin the details and small effects of my parents' lives into a narrative. How did they acquire a sense of taste or decide which movies to see? The things around them were like the raw materials for new American identities, and they forged as far as their car or the subway line could take them. Back then, it took weeks simply to schedule a long-distance phone call and ensure a quorum of the family would be available on the other end of the line. How sweet and musical those phone calls must have been. In the absence of available connections, they held on to an imaginary Taiwan, more an abstraction, a beacon, a phantom limb than an actual island. So they searched for traces of home in the faces of their classmates. They heard it wafting above the din where they shopped for groceries. It took me a while to understand that this was our life now, that my parents had worked hard in order to have a place in both worlds.
Hua Hsu is a staff writer at The New Yorker and teaches at Bard College. His memoir, Stay True, was published in 2022. Thanks for listening to What We Brought, a limited series from Illinois Public Media. I'm Neeli Shastri. Our producers are myself, Ariel Ravanay, and Kulsum Khan. This podcast's editor is Arjun Tukkar. Reginald Hardwick is Illinois Public Media's news director. Our cover art was designed by me, Neeli Shastri, with help from Troy McDonald and Kulsum Khan. Distribution assistance also comes from Troy McDonald. Join us for our next episode where we take a walk down the aisles of a historic Asian grocery store. You'll find this episode and more online at will.illinois.edu or wherever you get your podcasts.